If you're listening to this recording, I do not have slides for this presentation. Instead, there is a website, lauragibbs.net/Newcastle. So please open that website in a separate browser window while you listen to this audio, and you'll see how it all fits together. And now, the presentation. Spectrum of Africanness in Early Anthologies of African Folktales for Young Readers. I need to begin with an apology. This is not the presentation I had originally planned when we submitted this panel proposal last fall, but I hope it has actually turned into something even more useful. My original plan was based on a book I wrote in 2022, A Reader's Guide to African Folktales at the Internet Archive, a bibliography book that I self-published as an OER, open educational resource, which you can download at bibliography.lauragibbs.net. For this presentation, I was going to focus specifically on children's books of African folktales published in the 1930s and 1940s, which is when you start to see folktale books written by African authors like Prince Akiki Nyabongo and Ernest Balintuma Kalibala, and also some excellent books of children's folktales by anthropologists working in Africa like Harold Kurlander and Archie Tucker. But unfortunately, a lawsuit got in the way. In March 2023, a federal judge ruled against the Internet Archive in a lawsuit filed by Hachette, HarperCollins, Wiley, and Penguin Random House. I don't know how many of you have used the Internet Archive, but it's actually the first library in the world to have made literally millions of books available online with a practice known as controlled digital lending. As of right now, those books are still available for borrowing online. And in my Reader's Guide to African Folktales at the archive, I documented the 200 best African folktale books that I found there, including some rare books published by African publishers that are difficult or even impossible to find in U.S. libraries. After the judge's ruling in favor of the publishers, however, the Internet Archive will probably have to close their controlled digital lending library. They are appealing the judge's decision, but I'm honestly not optimistic about the outcome. I love what the Internet Archive has done to make books accessible to everyone in the world, and I had planned to feature their controlled digital lending books in this presentation. But now, with controlled digital lending being uncertain literally from day to day, I decided to focus on books in the public domain, which in the United States means books published in 1927 or earlier, books on which the publishers have no claim. I was worried about how that would turn out because these older books are even more deeply mired in the colonial and imperial past than books from the 1930s and 40s. And I was honestly not sure what would happen if I decided to limit myself to the public domain books. What kind of spectrum of Africanness could these older books really offer? So, with complete curiosity, I decided to find out. I identified 17 public domain children's books and one children's magazine, W.E.B. Du Bois's Brownie's book, which all featured African folktales, and then I inventoried the stories one by one. There were slightly more than 300 African folktales. And I am delighted to say there were actually a lot of great stories. So I realized it would be possible to speak meaningfully about a spectrum of Africanness in these public domain books. And here's the big bonus to having narrowed the focus. These public domain books are not only available to read online at the Internet Archive, they can also be downloaded and freely reused, remixed, and redistributed, which means I can share with you all these books and all these stories reconfigured at a website I made for this presentation. So instead of just listening to me describe the books and stories, you can explore them for yourselves. In fact, I hope you will start exploring them right now. Don't wait. Please use your laptops or your cell phones to go to this website, lauragibbs.net/Newcastle. I'll take a few minutes now to quickly describe the website, and then I'll spend the rest of my allotted time sharing some of the ways we can examine the spectrum of Africanness in these public domain books and stories. So, there is a books section with a books overview page. Of the 22 authors total, several of the books have co-authors, you will find one African author and 3 African American authors, plus 4 white American authors, 10 British authors, all white, and 4 white South African authors. There are 10 women authors and 12 men. Each book also has a page of its own at the website where you can see the whole book in PDF format embedded right there in the page, so that you can scroll and browse through the book at the site, and you can also open each PDF in a separate browser window, making it easy to download and save your own copy if you want. Then, in addition to these book PDFs, there are also PDFs of individual stories. Reading through the books, I decided that about half of the stories merited special attention and possible reuse, either because they represented an important African folktale type or for some specific stylistic reason. So, if you go to the Stories page, you will find the titles of those 150 stories and links to both a PDF version of the story, just the story excerpted from the book, plus a direct link to each individual story at the Internet Archive, where you can actually link to the contents of books page by page. Then, as you'll see there on the Stories page, for each story there is an annotation about the packet or packets in which that story appears. These are OER packets that I made by putting stories together, literally just merging the PDFs, so that each packet addresses a specific topic. You can see all those OER packets listed at the OER index page. For example, I made a packet about African languages, consisting of stories for which I can provide not just an English language version, but also the version originally recorded in Zulu or Swahili and so on. There's a packet about chain tales, which are one of the most distinctive African folktale types. There are lots of packets with trickster stories, as the trickster tradition is an incredibly important part of many African cultures. Perhaps of greatest interest are the packets about fairy tales, heroes, and monsters. In my experience teaching world folklore and mythology, those are the kinds of stories that my students were always most interested in. So, the idea is that these OER packets are ready for anyone to use. For example, they could be useful for people teaching undergraduate or graduate courses in children's literature, especially if the syllabus does not already address the question of children's literature from African sources. I've added brief introductory notes to each packet, and I've also released those notes into the public domain so that you can change them, expand them, do whatever you need to do in order to make these materials useful to you and to your students in your own teaching context. Finally, I included a page at the site with some technical information and tips for working with public domain materials. I've been using public domain materials in my own teaching since I first started teaching online courses back in 2002. Yes, that's right, 2002, 2 decades ago, long before the pandemic. And I've been delighted to see all the new technology tools and online repositories that make it so much easier now to discover and repurpose public domain materials like this. So, I hope very much that the website can be useful, and now I'll focus my remaining time on my topic, which is what the notion of the spectrum of Africanness could mean when applied to this corpus of books and stories. The easiest way, I think, to talk about a spectrum is by defining its extreme ends. So I'll start with the extreme end of Africanness, and what that would be is a story by C. Kamba Simango, which appears in the February 1921 issue of the Brownies Book magazine. The story is entitled Mpontolo ne Shulo, which gives you a sense of Africanness right there. Mpontolo and Shulo are the names of the elephant and the rabbit in the Ndao language, which is the author's native language. Only the subtitle, printed in much smaller type, tells us the English names of the animals, the lion and the hare. Columbus Kamba Simango was born in 1890 in what is now Mozambique, but what was then Portuguese East Africa. In 1914, he came to the United States to study at the Hampton Institute, and he later moved to New York, where he worked with Franz Boas at Columbia University. Together, Simango and Boas published a collection of Ndao folktales in the Journal of American Folklore, which includes both an Ndao text and an English translation, along with a selection of proverbs. In 1926, Simango returned to Mozambique, and he spent the rest of his life working as a missionary and political activist in both Mozambique and in Ghana, where he died in 1966. At the website, you'll find an OER packet about Simango's work with Boaz, and also about the Book of African Stories and Songs that he co-authored with Natalie Curtis Berlin, an American ethnomusicologist who studied both African and African diaspora music. And now, at the other end of the spectrum from Simango's story, I want to say something about the Bojabi tree, a book published in 1923 by Edith Rickert, a professor of medieval literature at the University of Chicago, who was also a cryptographer during World War I. The illustrations are by Gleb Botkin, a Russian immigrant to the United States whose father was the court physician to Tsar Nicholas II and was murdered with the Tsar and his family in 1918. As far as I know, neither Rickert nor Botkin had any personal connection to Africa, but together they adapted an African folktale in a children's book lavishly illustrated, in which they basically left everything African out of the story. On the very last page of the book, Rickert notes, adapted from an African folktale. She does not give her source, but I'm 99% sure that her source must have been a story in Robert Nassau's book, Where Animals Talk, West African Folklore Tales, which was published in 1912. Robert Nassau spent 4 decades as a medical missionary in what is now Equatorial Guinea, but was then Spanish Guinea. The book contains 61 folktales that Nassau collected from Mapongwe, Benga, and Fang storytellers, stories which Nassau then translated into English. The characters in Nassau's Bojabi tree story are Mbama, the boa constrictor, Kudu, the tortoise, Njaku, the elephant, and so on, using the Benga names of the animals, just as Simango used the Ndau names for the animals in his story. In Rickert's version of the Bojabi tree, however, the characters are Tabby Tiger, Bruno Bear, Robin Rat, Giddy Goat, Pinky Pig, and so on. Decidedly not African. So that's one way at looking at a spectrum of Africanness, with Simango at one end of the spectrum and Rickert at the other. Another question we can ask is about the audience for these stories. None of these books was written for an audience of African children, but there are 3 projects written for African American children. Du Bois's Brownies Book Magazine, which I've already mentioned, plus a book of African and diaspora animal fables retold by Alfonso Stafford, an African-American educator who also contributed to the Brownies book, and a wide-ranging anthology of African folk tales edited by Carter Woodson, an enormously influential and important African-American educator. The remaining 14 books were all written with white children as their intended audience, either white children in the U.S. or in Britain or in South Africa. Sometimes you don't even have to open the book to find this out because the title tells you so, like Arthur and Nancy Stiggin's book entitled Black Tales for White Children. There are 4 books which frame the stories with storytellers and their audiences depicted inside the book, and the differences there are stark also. 2 of those books with story frames, both South African, depict African storytellers telling stories to little white children, very much in the style of Joel Chandler Harris's Uncle Remus books, and very much under the influence of Harris. One of the South African books, Arthur Vaughan's Old Hendricks Tales, was illustrated by James A. Shepard, who also illustrated the very first British editions of Harris's Uncle Remus books. A 3rd book depicts the stories as told by the Swahili porters of the Emin Pasha relief expedition of 1887, with a fictive audience consisting of the African porters as well as their European employers. There are actually no children present at all, but the author, who was a member of the expedition, explains in the preface that he wrote the book with children as his intended audience, and he gives his book this especially appalling title, Stories Told in an African Forest by Grown-Up Children of Africa. The 4th book, with a storytelling frame, is very different from these 3. Mara Pratt Chadwick and Louise Lamprey's book, The Aloe Man, Stories from the Congo, presents the stories as told by a traveling African storyteller, the Aloe Man, who visits a village in the Congo, where his audience consists of the entire population of the village, but with a focus on a little boy and a little girl. There is not a single white person to be found in this book. So, while it would not meet contemporary standards of cultural authenticity, we can at least say that the impulse of these two authors, who were both American writers of children's books, aspired to a very different idea of Africanness than in the three other books that use a storytelling frame. I've created an OER packet about these story frames so that if you want, you can explore for yourselves about how these different authors represented African storytelling within the pages of their own books. So, I'm out of time now, I know, which means I'll stop here, but I hope that I may have made you curious to take a look through these books and stories. One of the OER packets is 20 Essential African Folktales, which might be a great place to begin if these African storytelling traditions are new to you. I want to close by extending my thanks to the organizers of this event. I really appreciate this opportunity to share my work at a global conference, and I also want to add that I would be very eager to partner with anyone who is interested in using public domain mythology and folktale materials in their teaching, whether that means teaching K through 12 students or teaching college students or teaching future teachers. My own special areas of interest are African and diaspora folktales, along with South Asian folktales, and also the indigenous folktale traditions of the Americas. But I would be glad to help create public domain resources and websites like what I've done here for any folktale and mythology traditions. I spent 20 years creating public domain resources for my own students, and now that I've retired from teaching, I'd like to continue creating public domain resources, but now for other people's classes and students. So if this is of interest to anybody out there, please get in touch. You can find me at Twitter, where I'm Online Course Lady, Online CRS Lady, or you can contact me at my email address, which is laurakgibbs@gmail.com. So thanks again, and I hope you enjoy browsing the books and stories and the OER packets there at the website. Happy reading.